Welcome to the Raw Food Health Empowerment Show. Today, we are exploring how a plant-based vegan lifestyle can do more than transform your physical health, which we talk a lot about on this channel, but it can also radically impact your emotional well-being, identity, and connection to others and the world around you. I'm your host, Samantha Salmon, National Board Certified Health and Wellness Coach, and I am joined by my wonderful guest for the second time, Dr. Angela Crawford. Dr. Crawford is a psychologist, vegan educator, and author of the new book, The Vegan Transformation, A Journey to Heal Yourself and the World. It's coming out soon, and we'll get to hear more about that. Dr. Crawford holds a doctorate in clinical psychology and spent 25 years as a psychotherapist empowering clients toward holistic well-being. Angela speaks and teaches on the psychological benefits of veganism and is passionate about the power of personal transformation to create a more fulfilling and purposeful life and a kinder, healthier world. Dr. Crawford, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Really happy to be
Yes.
here.
And I'm really excited to have this conversation. We don't really get to have it too often on this channel, so I'm really looking forward to it. And for those of you joining us live, please give us a hey in the comments wherever you're watching. Love to connect. Definitely make sure you ask all the questions you have for Dr. Crawford while we're on live. That's the benefit of being here live. So thank you again for joining. So in your book, wonderful book, I love how you basically share the story arc of how your own vegan transformation, all of the challenges and blessings that basically came from that transformation, the learning lessons, the difficulties, and also piecing in some other elements that we don't talk enough about. I want to start with something you mentioned in the book when you talk about your story. You mentioned being too overwhelmed to change at one point, right? So you were aware of this thing, but you just felt like it was too much. And it had me thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because I hear this a lot from people. And I would love for you to maybe talk about what your experience was like, because I know there's a lot of folks out there that feel the very same way, like they want to make a change for whatever reason. Most likely, if you're watching this channel, you have like a health reason or something why you want to make this change, but it just feels like with everything else you have going on, it's a burden. How did you deal with this emotionally?
Yeah, that's so interesting. You talk about Maslow's hierarchy, that the stages that we can go through in our development that go from meeting our physiological needs, our safety needs, our need for love and belonging, and then self-esteem. And then kind of as we meet those needs, we move more often into what's called self-actualization, being the best we can be. But a lot of times as we're struggling with feeling safe and meeting our physical needs and just growing in our self-worth and our sense of connection, all those things can take over, where it's harder to focus on growth sometimes. And thinking of myself and my own journey, I think I knew at some level I was not a healthy eater. I ate a lot of comfort foods. I definitely had certain food addictions, chocolate and sweets.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, cooking just felt overwhelming. So I grew up eating a traditional American diet. That my mother was I considered a great cook, but it was the traditional stuff. Meat, potatoes. There might be a vegetable there with butter or cheese sauce on it. That's what I grew up with. And then when I moved out of the house and went to college and everything, I just ate what was convenient. It might be fast food. It might be a microwave meal. When I finally did start cooking, later on, it was the same stuff over and over again, just convenient, easy, repetitive. And, so I knew at some level it wasn't the healthiest, but whenever I thought like, oh, I should try new recipes or I should cook healthier, well, one, I was kind of confused about what healthy was because we
Mm-hmm.
get such mixed messages. And then it just felt too much to do. I just felt like just eating was enough of a challenge. And then I'd, under stress, run across the street after work and grab something sweet to eat at the convenience store or whatever. Just so it was just meeting stress needs through comfort foods and convenience. But what changed for me was I saw a program. It was about workers in a meat processing plant. And I will add, before I saw this program, about, I don't know, a couple months before, I had been at a workshop or training that had all plant-based food served. It was a conference center. And I think, that planted a seed for me because I ate all plant-based, and that was the first time I understood what someone who was vegetarian or vegan would actually eat. Before that, I'd heard of vegetarians and vegans, but I didn't know what they would eat. It just seemed unsustainable to me. But after eating at this conference center, it was really good. And there was just such a variety of food and delicious flavors. And it just planted a seed, but not enough to take action. And then I saw this program, and the program showed these workers, many of whom were immigrants, having frequent injuries and really difficult work experiences, and their employer basically giving them a hard time if they tried to get treatment or take time off, that they were at risk of losing their jobs. And it just got me thinking about how food gets to me and all the layers that happen for that process to unfold. And I hadn't known anything about factory farming. And, watching that show got me thinking more about it and just wanting to look more into what's the whole process that happens with meat. And I wanted to try something plant-based. I just wanted to see, okay, what tasted pretty good. Maybe this is a direction to go. So the very next day, I bought a cookbook. I tried out a recipe of this artichoke, red pepper, spinach lasagna. And I had never been much of a cook, so I had to buy new pots and pans as I was cooking to make it. And it turned out really delicious. And it opened up a whole new door for me because suddenly the idea of cooking was an adventure. And I realized I'd never liked handling meat, but I just hadn't known that before. Mm-hmm. And I was sad. Once I made that lasagna and I enjoyed it, my family enjoyed it, I just started reading everything I could to understand more about food and our choices. And I learned about the ethics of what we eat and how the animals are affected, the conditions they live in. I learned the health aspects too. I'd grown up with a family history of heart disease, a lot of my father and a lot of other family members. And I just knew after learning about Dean Ornish's work, reversing heart disease, that, hey, this could be not only kinder to animals and kinder to the ethics in general that I hold, but also good for me. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of how that unfolded. I think, learning it was possible through trying it, and then having a strong enough motivation to actually act on it.
That part. Yeah, I noticed that. And we also got a heart when you mentioned Dr. Dean Ornish. Apparently there's some Dr. Ornish fans that are watching. You can make yourself known in the chat and give a shout out to Dr. Ornish. Yes, like as we're thinking about, when you made the statement, I was too overwhelmed to change, but then you saw all these things that emotionally motivated you to not only make a change, but to make one of the hardest dishes possible, in my opinion. Like, for that to be the first foray into plant-based eating that you're making on your own, lasagna, where you have to put all this stuff together. I do want to talk about that, but I want to slowly get into that, because after that point of, it's just too much right now, then you had the thought, well, I could eat like this if someone cooked for me, right? I've heard this so much. I literally had to write a blog post on it, because it's like, well, you could have, if you have the money, but if the money's not there, then obviously you have the time. And so it took you a while before you decided to carve out the time and space to decide, I'm going to make a dish. What helped you shift from that limiting belief of I need a chef if I'm going to do this, to someone who discovered the joy of cooking? Was it just seeing those images in the documentary about those workers?
Yeah, it's funny how in retrospect you can look back and see all the seeds that are planted on you making changes in your life, seeds you might not see at the time. I was younger at the time I made the choice to first become vegetarian and then later vegan. And so I was fairly healthy. So, many of us change because of health. And I didn't yet have that as my motivator because I was blessed at that time to still be fairly healthy. Although I knew, people in my life had died younger than I would have liked, due to lifestyle related conditions. So I had that awareness. Um, so for me, I think a few things, discovering that it could be possible and enjoyable was a foundation because it's hard to change if you think it's not going to be enjoyable. I had some sense that being plant-based would be healthier, but whenever I had seen someone living plant-based before, I didn't see the whole picture. I only saw, for example, I knew one woman that was vegan and she would just bring carrots and celery to work. And that's great, but that didn't seem enough to me. Like I was like, how could you be, I'm sure she ate much more than that, but that was all I saw. So I didn't know the full picture of how she did this lifestyle. What would that look like? So I think eating at that, the workshop planted the seed, but it still was sort of, there wasn't enough motivation to change. When I ate the food, it was like, okay, it's doable, but yeah, I'm not a cook. I still had that identity that I'm not a cook. So another event that happened was my stepdaughter came home from college and she was vegetarian for a while, and she came for Thanksgiving and she ate all the vegetables but none of the meat, and she
Mm-hmm.
seemed to enjoy the meal. And I was like, I could probably do that. I could probably enjoy just the vegetables. I don't really feel like I have to have turkey. So that was another seed planted. And then seeing that program, there was just something about it. It made me, as I thought about how the food came to me, I had more of a sense that not only was the process unkind, to the animals and the workers of how the meat was produced, it just, there was some sense that it's probably not really good for me, So there was all these different factors that came together that finally gave me a reason that was strong enough to want to explore it. And then once I
Mm-hmm.
started to explore it, I actually found I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So
I
it was
think
just
this
a
is
process.
it's a really great thing for folks to hear, especially health conscious vegans who are just like they're shaking their family members, they're shaking, their friends, their community members, folks in the church, all these people, and they're like, you need to change. But what you have here is that you are just full blown, like compassionate vegan, interested in health too. So you're making conscious choices, and how you got here were all these seeds that were planted over a span of time. You had to hear the same thing basically from different people in different ways,
Yeah.
in order for it to really take root.
Yes, very true. And certainly we can all hope now that as it becomes better known, because, my becoming vegetarian was 18 years ago, we can hope now that it's becoming better known, and maybe we don't have to wait as long for people to be open to it, but
Mm-hmm.
it's still the reality that sometimes seeds do have to be planted before someone can see where it fits in their own life. And I
Yeah.
think it needs to feel doable and, I guess, enjoyable. It needs to feel like a positive, not, depriving. So we have to get past a mindset of that this would be depriving to realize actually it couldn't be abundant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so you decided to dive all the way into the deep end with a lasagna dish. So what was that experience like? So you write in the book that you start the dish and you realize you don't even have all the pots you need. So you literally leave the kitchen and drive out to the store to buy more pots. I mean, what was that like, it didn't stop you apparently, but what was that experience like?
Yeah, so interesting. Um, first of all, I think I enjoyed lasagna, so it seemed like something familiar that I could try to make plant-based. And I think the recipe that I chose was not a super complicated one. Some lasagnas can be much more complicated than this one was, but it was still, like you say, a bit of a step for someone who wasn't a cook. And I think something happened with like the colorful vegetables. It was, artichoke, red pepper, and spinach. So all these colorful vegetables. Um, it was like the flavors and the ingredients seemed interesting and inviting. And I don't know, something shifted where it became an exploration and an adventure. And wish I could know how to prescribe that for other people to like discover that for themselves. But, maybe just knowing that's possible can plant that seed.
Yeah. I know from my experience that, like, lasagna, honestly, kudos to you, because this is, well, even making raw vegan lasagna, which is way less work than cooked lasagna. I mentally prepare myself for that because I have to have space on the calendar, because if my brain has like, oh, I have to do this and I have to do this and I have to do this, I'm not doing lasagna. Lasagna takes up more mental bandwidth than, like, if you were to make, I don't know, just steam some broccoli and pair it with quinoa, and like, this thing that's quick.
Yeah.
So the fact that you even started with that is like mind blown. Like, good for you.
Well, and I chose a Saturday. It was a Saturday, which helped. I had a little more time, and and I had people I was going to share it with. I think that helped too. I was going to share it with my then boyfriend, now husband, and his family, and I think having something that I could share with them also motivated me. So if it took for me, maybe I wouldn't have been as motivated as even though I should care about doing it for myself, but there's something about sharing it with others that makes it special too.
Yes. And you talk about this actually in the book about relationships and how caring is a motivating factor. A lot of great threads, so many different threads in the book that we can pull on. You mentioned something interesting that I've heard from folks who literally they're eating vegan, and I put that in quotations because of the question I'm going to ask. They're eating vegan for health reasons, right? But I've heard them say things like, well, I'm vegan at home, but if we're having a party here, then I put that down. Basically, I take a break from veganism. when I go to see family, I take a break, or it's like the holidays and I take a break from veganism, which, for an actual vegan, that's like startling. Like, how do you take a break from a lifestyle, from a value system, But this was something that you actually mentioned in the book, where you said, I'm vegan except with family or something, like that sometime vegan. I feel like you mentioned that in the book as your experience. I just kind of wanted to get, and this was part of your transition point. I wanted to get your experience, since you had that kind of same mentality in the beginning of, I guess, not putting that pressure on yourself, but still utilizing the terminology. How do you feel about that now after 18 years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I have mixed feelings. So on the one hand, I'm all about how can we change in whatever way will work, and as a psychologist, I've seen people work on change and then expect perfection or purity and not be able to achieve that and then give up, because since they weren't perfect, they had a relapse or a lapse on whatever it was they were trying to change, whether diet or some other thing. They're just like, well, I can't do this, and so I'm going to just go back to my old lifestyle. And I definitely wouldn't want that for anyone, including myself, Yeah. So thinking of my own journey, and maybe some other people can relate. When I first became vegetarian, which was my path to later becoming vegan, I wasn't yet convinced I was going to become fully vegetarian. It was I was kind of easing into discovering what that would mean for me. And was this something I was willing to commit to? I knew I wanted to move in that direction, but I had my blocks. I guess I had and I think my biggest blocks, and these were there too when I turned to vegan later on, was the social aspect. The very thing you're describing, going to a gathering and maybe I want to eat vegetarian, but they're all having this other thing, meat, when I was shifting to vegetarian. And then later when I was shifting to vegan, it might be pizza with cheese on it, So it was sort of like, how do I handle those situations? it got to a point where it wasn't even my own cravings anymore for those things. It was really more the social aspect of like, I have to be different. I have to speak up. Um, Seems like that should be easy. I was an independent person in so many ways, but I just found, that, wow, there's a part of me that has this almost social hypnosis, like I think a lot of us do. I came to find that through my research and with other vegans. I'm not alone. And just in general, we humans we're connection oriented creatures. We want to fit in. We want to belong to a social circle. So I think it was learning that my commitment to this change was greater than my desire to fit in. And that didn't happen immediately for me. I had to I did a lot of reading about veganism and vegetarianism, that just plant-based living, that made me finally get to a place where my commitment was greater than this desire to fit in. So my commitment to my own health, my commitment to my values. So just knowing, for some people that happens overnight. They have a health scare, they have something that opens them to the ethical aspects of veganism. They have something that happens and they're just like, I'm committed overnight, and they don't even have a second thought. And that is wonderful when that happens, but that's not everybody's journey. And so for those of us that it takes a little longer, not to beat up on yourself. I mean, I just say, keep moving in the direction and keep reading and learning so that you find greater and greater commitment. Because what I found through the research is that the more reasons someone has for their change in lifestyle, the more likely they are to stick to it. And if some of those reasons include not only their own well-being, but also other things they care about, that can help too sometimes. And also just, changing can take time. So we have to sometimes put things into place to make it more doable. Sometimes we have to set up our lifestyle so that this is going to work and we can actually sustain it. We need to learn how to meal prep, how to shop for the foods there's different practical skills we need to learn, and then different social skills we need to learn, how to speak up with others and how to communicate, hey, this is how I'm eating and this is why I'm eating this way, and I need your support.
Yeah.
So once I learned those things, it became much more doable. But it's sort of like, I think we're so used to eating on autopilot that to realize that we have to learn some skills and implement them to make this doable and sustainable. And
yeah, because most of Americans are eating a diet that is leading them into metabolic dysfunction. Most of Americans are not metabolically healthy. And so if you are on the path to be healthy, and we're going to be talking about some of the other aspects of veganism, but you're going to be different. I say that all the time. You're part of the elite class. It's such a huge issue that even the army is having issues because they're not able to find folks who are healthy enough to serve, and it's like,
I've read that.
So, and there, economic aspects to this about, the burden, the financial burden on the country, the healthcare system, the chaos that created during the pandemic, all of these things, which you talk about. I love your whole section in the book about the pandemic and zoonotic diseases, why that happens, how we could prevent it in the future, and just bringing that into the whole, you build the whole case as to your point, in order to make a change, to feel motivated to make a change, you kind of have to be a lawyer on the case, all of the things as to why this is necessary to really get yourself in gear, to make it worth it, to really step up into leadership. And you got brave, eventually, and decided to tell your family at a family dinner that you're no longer eating meat. You talk about how scared you were to do that. Bring us into that moment, your family, because you had mentioned that your daughter, I believe, right? Your daughter, your stepdaughter?
Yeah, my husband's daughter, my stepdaughter.
Yeah. Basically kind of introduce you to this lifestyle, and watching her eat motivated you. So now you're telling showing other family members that you're no longer eating this. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, well, my husband was, then he was my boyfriend at the time then, but he was supportive from the beginning. He had a long time ago read the book Diet for a Small Planet. So he kind of got it about why not eating meat could be good on a lot of levels. Although he wasn't vegetarian at the time, but he kind of came right on board. So he was very supportive. But I was really I was still somewhat new in my relationship with him. I mean, not that new, but I was a little intimidated by his mother. We would have Sunday dinner every Sunday at her house, and it always involved some sort of meat. Like she might have steaks on the grill or something like that. And so that was my like last hard place to say, hey, I'm not eating this way anymore, to say to her. And I sort of prepared for it. I mentally, I didn't want to be disrespectful. That was, I think, the concern. So I mentally prepared for it that, I'd reached the point, I'd read enough. This was it. I wasn't going to just be vegetarian at home and then not vegetarian elsewhere. This was something I just came to an inner knowing that I needed to honor my values and commit to it. And I will just say for others on this journey that making a commitment leads to greater change than just being half-hearted. I've certainly found that over and over again. Each time I finally made that commitment, it didn't always happen overnight, but it led to far greater change than just being wishy-washy, like, oh, I'll do this now and not do it other times, So I finally just prepared for it and just said to her, that it was nothing personal against her cooking, but I'd come to a personal decision to not eat meat anymore and, to be vegetarian. And, so I wouldn't be eating the meat portion of the meal that we were having. Later on, I had to have the same conversation about the dairy and the eggs when I came further along on my journey, but started with the meat. And, she responded okay, but she did make a comment like, oh, you're losing a lot of weight, are you sure this is healthy, that kind of thing. And I just said, I'm doing all kinds of reading about all the nutritional parts of it to make sure I'm covering all my bases. So I'm feeling pretty good about it, and it was fine. There were times that I think there was a little resentment maybe because she was the one to provide the meal and I wasn't eating the way that was expected, sort of. But I was committed and I just kind of stuck to it. And over time, I will say the whole family started to really enjoy my vegan soups that I would make started to bring them every Sunday as she got older and wasn't cooking as much. And she really loved them. So she would look forward to it and she'd be like, is Angela bringing her soups today? So there were changes over time.
So did you find that like the fear you had to even bring it up was like kind of like a waste of time, like it wasn't worth being fearful over, or do you think that folks really should respect that fear?
And yet I think in this case it was more because of the particular relationship, and so that might be true for others of us, that maybe we're not nervous to bring it up with some people, but there might be some people that, maybe they in some way make us a little more uncomfortable or intimidated. And so then it's more challenging. So yeah, it was a waste. And yet I guess it was something I had to go through, of speaking my truth, even in the face, I was a bit younger then, speaking my truth, even in the face of maybe someone else not approving of that or agreeing with that, and doing it in a way that, really conveyed it was, because how I'm sure some of the listeners can relate. Sometimes family, especially older family, mothers, grandmothers, they can view food as like an extension of themselves. And, and so if you're saying no to that, they might take it as a rejection. And I wanted to really convey it wasn't that, and so I think we can find that balance of conveying I love you or I care about you, and I'm not eating this food. And there's other ways we can connect, other than eating this particular food that's been so associated with love or nurturance or whatever.
Yeah, because you mentioned too in the book that like, thriving as a vegan versus surviving as a vegan all boils down to relationships, connection, who you're hanging out with. And what you're talking about is really like preserving relationships. Even though you're making this change, other people aren't aware of all the things that you know. And that's why you're making the change and they're not making the change, right? What would be your best tips after having gone through those experiences to preserve those relationships and do, as you said, say no to the food, but still make sure that this person walks away with knowing and understanding it's not a rejection of them.
Hmm. Yeah, I've come to think that that is a really important part of this whole journey. To step back for a moment, research shows that when they've looked at people that were formerly vegan but not vegan now, the biggest reasons for people not sticking with it are socially related reasons, whether it be lack of social support from other vegans, whether it be people in their own life giving them a hard time about it, and not having support in their family system, handling social situations, having to be the one that's different and not, you mentioned that being different, not being yet okay with how to handle that, being that leader. So I think, handling these social challenges is so key to being able to thrive with this lifestyle. And I think it could be true of any lifestyle, but it's especially true with a plant-based vegan lifestyle because again, research suggests that we're maybe 3% of the population, unless if you look at a truly healthy version of it, the more whole food plant-based version, that might be 1%. So we're a truly small percentage, even though it's growing and becoming more popular, and hopefully we'll get to more of a tipping point. But because we are often the minority in our social circles, it makes this social piece so much more relevant and important. So I'd say one piece of that is having other vegan supports, so having things like this podcast, where you can listen to other vegans and learn from them, having group support of different kinds, whether it be an online group or an in-person vegan or plant-based group, and reading and learning, just having these vegan supports so you're not alone and that you're on the right path, that there's truly something to back what you're doing on every level, health and otherwise, and just not being alone and learning from each other, because there's other people you'll meet in your vegan groups that have gone through the same challenges, and how did they overcome them, how did they handle them. So that's, I'd say first, not having that support can be the biggest reason that someone doesn't stay the path. And I found it just, some local and some online groups, and, just finding people you can connect with. And you don't have to have a lot, just even a few quality connections can make a big difference. And then the other piece along with that is learning assertive communication so that you can speak up with your family and loved ones about what this journey means to you, so that at the very least they'll support you. I mean, yes, we'd love for them to join us too, and sometimes that happens, but if they don't, we still want them to support us so they're not undermining or sabotaging, ideally, what we're doing, or giving us a hard time about it, or feeling rejected, because that might lead them to sabotage. If they can know, hey, I'm doing this for my health, if that's the reason you're doing it, and I've read the research, I'm reading how to do this in a good way nutritionally, and I just really want your support with this. And that means understanding why I'm making this choice. It means supporting me in making the right food choices that fit with my health, and whatever other ways you'd like them to support you. I think when we ask for people's support directly, they're often disarmed a little bit and less likely to be defensive. Whereas if we're pushing them to change, which I'm not saying you shouldn't encourage your family to change, there's times to do that, but there's better ways to do that, versus being overly judgmental or critical or things like that, where people are going to get defensive and just not want to hear what you have to say.
I love that point about asking for support, because people love to be of service to other people. You mentioned in the book that we are wired for compassion neurobiologically, and I was shocked to hear this, to read that. Explain more about the science behind this, why you would even say that.
Yeah, it was interesting to me too, because it sometimes doesn't seem like the world's very compassionate, when we see what we see in the news, and yet the science that I read shows that, first of all, I was surprised, like Darwin even said, Charles Darwin, said that it was our strongest instinct to have compassion, even stronger than self-interest. So, and then, looking at the brain and the nervous system, they find that we have wiring that makes us naturally empathize and feel compassion towards others. Now, like for example, if we witness someone suffering, our pain centers can light up too in the brain and nervous system. And there's parts of our nervous system that are more geared towards, wanting to help, that get activated. And this is all natural parts of our nervous system. And it even can feel good. I think one of the researchers said it even activates our dopamine receptors when we feel like we can be of service to someone, which is a feel good chemical that we like to feel. But at the same time, maybe we don't all have this as strongly as, it can be shut down. Let's put it that way. I think, we learn to compartmentalize our compassion, and we can learn to disconnect from our compassion. So even though it is wired into us, it doesn't mean that we always feel it all the time, or that we feel it for all beings or all people. We can sometimes get where we feel it towards people that are like us, or certain animals, but not other animals, so it can be very compartmentalized. And that might be why it surprised you to know it was, me too. But it is actually beneficial for us. They find that, when we nurture our compassion, it actually helps us physically and emotionally, as well as obviously being helpful societally.
And you see that the way you frame it in the book is like, this is an avenue to really grow that muscle. And you talk about like compassion skills. I believe you use that, building those skills. What does this look like practically? Like, how can people build compassion skills?
Yeah. I think, first is realizing that compassion is beneficial for us too. So I think sometimes we're afraid of compassion because some of us are empathic people who can get overwhelmed by, the distress in the world. So I don't know, if a lot of your listeners might be women, but some of us who are women, we're, kind of raised to be caregivers, and, we can feel overwhelmed by others' needs. And so I think there can be this empathy overwhelm that makes us want to shut down. So I think first, just knowing that you can learn to hold compassion in a way that includes yourself too, and that is grounded. And it doesn't mean you have to fix everything in the world or have the answers for everybody else or be a caregiver for everybody else. It's a circle of compassion where you include your own well-being as well as caring about, others. And some of the ways to strengthen it, one really helpful way is the loving kindness meditation that you might have heard of. There's a lot. I do actually, with my book, have a link to like where I have a recording of the different meditations that are in my book. But if you even just Google loving kindness meditation, you would find a lot of different versions of it online that you can listen to. And generally what it does is it has you start by sending phrases of loving kindness to yourself first, because if we don't include ourselves, it's hard to have a grounded compassion for others that's really going to be healthy and not overwhelming. So starting by, may I be peaceful, may I be happy, may I be filled with loving kindness, may I be well, things like that, may I be safe. And then you think of someone you love and you envision sending it to them, and you send the same wishes to them. May you be healthy. You picture their face. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be filled with loving kindness. May you be safe. May you be well. And you might continue with people you care about. Ideally, you eventually also extend it to people that you find more challenging. That can be more of a growth area, where you can think of someone you maybe have a harder time with, and just as I want to be happy, may you be happy. Just as I want to be peaceful, may you be peaceful. And then last of all, may all beings everywhere be happy and peaceful and free. And by doing this regularly, it seems to help strengthen this more grounded, mindful, healthy version of compassion that, isn't either you being too much in your head, I've got to fix everything, or being disconnected and shut down. It's a more grounded, holistic version of it.
Yeah. And you also mentioned that compassion is contagious. So I guess the idea is if you, can work on those skills for yourself, then other people around you will just pick up on it. right?
Yeah. Yeah, it can help. I think, I'm thinking of like people I've talked to. If someone shows compassion for how I'm feeling and interest in how I'm feeling and just wanting to understand it, does lead me to be a little bit more interested and open to their point of view, versus if they come at me with judgment or disconnect, I'm more likely to be disconnected from them. And, so it
Hmm.
doesn't guarantee that someone else will come to you with compassion, but it opens the door for it, if you extend that towards others.
Yeah, and I know for a lot of folks in my community, compassion for animals. You talked about this disconnection, like a cognitive dissonance, right? And how we basically learn that to kind of compartmentalize our compassion, as you say. Compassion for animals that, we're used to eating from childhood, like sausages and all this stuff. I mean, we don't even call them by their real names, pig, cow, whatever, So you mentioned this term that I do want to introduce my community to, because I know a lot of people aren't familiar, carnism. And if you can explain what that is, and like, I guess the defenses that come up when you even, you know, bring forth some of this stuff to folks who are still in that mindset of like, of course we eat pigs and cows. For me, I know for me personally, when I heard that in France it's normal to eat horses, I was just beside myself. Like, how could you eat a horse? They're such beautiful animals. And then I started to piece things together. Well, what's the difference between that, a cow in India? They worship the cow, right? So I would love for you to kind of explain like carnism and ideas
Sure.
around that, how to break through folks' defenses when you
Yeah.
start mentioning this.
Yeah, well, carnism was a term coined by a vegan psychologist, social psychologist named Dr. Melanie Joy. She's written a few books that are really interesting. One is a book called Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. So that was based on her doctoral research. She wrote another book that I do also highly recommend for this audience, anyone that wants to improve communication. It's called Beyond Beliefs, and it's about communication and relationships between vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters. And so it really gets into some of the communication stuff we're talking about here in more depth. And even though she's gearing it, I think, a bit more towards ethical vegans, I think the concepts of how to communicate well would fit for any reason that you're vegan, even whether it's more your health or whatever, because it's the same idea as how do I speak up for my truth. But coming back to carnism, Dr. Joy, she had done research she was curious about why we have empathy and concern for certain animals and not others. And, she herself had a transition to becoming vegan after she ate a tainted hamburger that had, I forget what it's called, some horrible thing in it that made her violently ill, and she never wanted to eat meat again. And so this led to this whole journey for her. And she found, it interesting that when she tried to share with people why she was vegan and what she had learned, people would be like, "Don't tell me about it. I don't ruin my meal," that sort of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so she just became very curious. Why are we so close to this conversation about what we're eating and what happens to animals? And what she basically discovered was what she called carnism, which is that we have this socially and culturally developed concept that certain animals are, we view certain animals as food, and certain animals differently, like worthy of our compassion. So some animals we view as, our companions, our friends. They can share the bed with us. They're like our children. And then other animals we've been socialized to view differently, that they're food or they're an object that doesn't deserve that kind of compassion and concern. And it's very much culturally conditioned into us, because as you're mentioning, which animals are considered food differs from culture to culture. Some we know consider dogs food. And, you mentioned horses, whereas here that, those are definitely not what we think. But as you say, pigs and cows and chickens, we just don't give a second thought. Well, why is that? It's not the same in each culture. It's something we're really conditioned from a young age to believe is how it is and how it's always been. Um, so we're raised really to believe it's natural, it's normal, and necessary. And we don't really question it because it's coming at us from every authority figure that we have in our life. It seems like it's what the history has been. And yet, as Dr. Joy points out, there's a lot of things that have been part of our history that we now know are not right. There's many, many things that were considered normative in our society that we now know are just plain wrong. Mm-hmm. So just because something is the norm, quote unquote, doesn't mean that it's right. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's natural or necessary, And so as you look a little more closely to how animals are raised, most of it, especially now with factory farming being 99% of the meat that's produced, it's far from natural. They live in very unnatural conditions that are not healthy for them or for us consuming it. The food that they're fed and the way that they're raised and the conditions they live in. And then is it necessary? Well, there's a lot of vegans and plant-based people out there that are just, thriving just fine without, any meat in their diet. So it's just sort of like learning to break through this conditioning, indoctrination, this learning that is just so ingrained in our culture. It takes something happening sometimes that we finally start to question it and be like, is this really true that I need it to survive? I mean, I believed that at one time. That's what I thought was true.
And in 2025, people are still saying this, that they need protein, and protein looks like this, and which the science does not support. But it's even with science, and you talk about this in your book about conflicting health messages. So it's like sometimes it's hard, especially if there's been a generation of people that heard a thing, you have to have eggs for breakfast, to pull them out of this, like stupor they're in, like this hypnosis, like to just get them off that track. I mean, everything we've talked about so far is just a sliver. It's just a taste of the book, The Vegan Transformation. I highly encourage all of you to get this book. And I really enjoyed this interview talking to you and the way you really fleshed out your story in the book, because I find it so valuable for me as a health practitioner, someone who's been vegan for 16 years, and just seeing, what it's like for other people. What is necessary? What does it take actually to get someone on a healthier path? I think it speaks a lot to what's needed in the field, and it just all hands on deck, basically. You're not, for anyone out there having anxiety and frustration, dealing with family members and friends, just know that it's not just going to be you being the example and sharing the message. We're in community with all of these people, and it's going to, more people are needed. So as more and more folks come online and they have their personal transformation, sharing books, sharing documentaries. I mean, you mentioned all this stuff. You talked a lot about books, which is really important. There are large communities who are not reading. That's not part of what they do, or the people around them, what they do. So having different modalities and mediums in which you're reaching people, audio, video, short form, long form, all of this is important. So I really appreciate you.
Wow. Well, I appreciated being here. This was a really, really great conversation. It helped to go a little deeper on some of these things. So,
yeah. And I would love to hear from you all that are joining us live. I see a few of you. Thank you for the hearts and the thumbs up. Let me know in the comments, what were your key takeaways? Was there anything new that you learned today? Anything interesting? Anything impactful? Anything that's inspiring you to kind of modify how you are communicating, either plant-based eating, veganism. I think a lot of what we talked about today is relevant for any type of change you're trying to make. Like, because when you're talking about, when you were trying to stop eating meat, having hard conversations with family members, for some folks, it's getting off sugar and, telling the aunt, I don't want the baked cookies. Please stop pushing them on me. I mean, it's relevant for all of these things. How to have you talked about assertive communication and doing it in a very loving and compassionate way. This is a skill set all of us, including omnivores, which I don't even believe in the term omnivores. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. But meat eaters, all of us need to be building that muscle. So I really appreciate you. I want to, before we close for the day, what's one thing that you hope people feel or do differently after they read your book, The Vegan Transformation?
Well, one, I guess, is to really celebrate the positives of our lifestyle change, because sometimes we can get caught up in what's challenging or what's hard or the difficulties. But there's so many benefits that can come, one, with honoring our goals and commitments to really make a change and to begin with. But then this particular change, we're nourishing our nervous system, our mind, our body, our spirit, both through what we're putting in our body with the whole plant foods and, that give all the nutrients, and then what we're not putting in, which is a lot of inflammatory, heavy food that doesn't nourish us and is actually harmful in so many ways. So there can be this peace that can come with that. So really connecting with the positives and really, I think, being mindful of them. When you and I met last time, we talked about journaling, and I think that could be a great tool for people as they're on their plant-based vegan journey, is to journal about the benefits you have, both health-wise as well as what opens up for you mentally and spiritually. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we don't think about that, but that can be a really important motivator that keeps us going even through the hard times.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you, Juan, for commenting, typing in the chat. He says, thank you very much to you both for this great talk. Thank you for being live and for participating. And you guys, you got to get the book, The Vegan Transformation. There's so much more in the book. Lots of helpful information, lots of new stuff. I know definitely for all of you, there's going to be a lot of new information, things that you want to just even study, because what I'm finding too in the community is that folks are pushing back. Oh, and with stuff even beyond veganism, like even organic. Why are you eating organic? Why are you not eating meat? Oh, you need to have eggs, all this stuff, right? And folks don't know what to say. They know that they're doing it for themselves. They know why they're doing it for themselves, but they just don't know how to respond to these folks. Read the book. Highlight your talking points, study your talking points, be so convicted in what you're doing that when you go out, you can be an ambassador and just plant the seed. Because you heard Angela's story, right? There were many seeds planted by many different people that led to her being on this path. So if this is something you're interested in doing, in being that light, spreading health, spreading compassion, the spiritual, you talk about all sorts of things, political, social justice issues, the spiritual, you cover all of it in your book. So highlight those talking points, study it, and just be, get armored with that so you can, feel confident to have conversations with folks. And you also have a workshop coming up, right, Dr. Crawford? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So for people that pre-order, because the official release date is a week from today, Earth Day, April 22nd, but it's available for pre-order through most online booksellers, all the usual ones, but also some additional ones on my website, which I think we'll have listed somewhere. It's angelacrawfordphd.com. I have a book page and I list several booksellers there. So you can go to your favorite one, pre-order it, and then there's a place on that book page where if you want to attend a bonus workshop that I'm having this Saturday morning, this coming Saturday, it's just for those who pre-order by Saturday. And it's just a bonus workshop about vegan transformation, how you can thrive with your vegan lifestyle emotionally, socially, spiritually. So just you go to my book page on my website, fill in the form where it, gives you to where did you order it, basically, and it's just so I know that you pre-ordered. It's available in paperback or ebook. So
Awesome. Yes. And the link to get the book and to have the opportunity to attend that workshop is in the description wherever you're watching this video. Thanks again, Dr. Crawford, for being here, for writing this book, for sharing your story. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us live. And until next time, we shall see you. Go out there, be great ambassadors, okay?